Don't you wish that everybody was on the same page theologically, right? Don't you sometimes sit back and think, boy, I wish people all understood what we understand about God and his love for us and his plan for us, and that if we follow his way, we'll have joy and peace and love and patience and gentleness and goodness and faith. And so there's this desire in all of us that we want others to know what we know about God. And this is expressed with children who are raised in church. Maybe they'll express it to you by the age of 10 or 11 or 12 years old, as my son did. My son was probably about 11 years old, and we were having dinner one day, and he's coming to the realization not everybody believes in Jesus, not everybody believes in following the Bible. And he stated to me, when I become president of the United States, I'm going to make a law that everybody has to go to church on Sunday. And from that young mind's perspective, it makes so much rational sense, because if there is a God and he loves us and Jesus is his son who died upon the cross, everybody should know. Therefore, let's mandate it, let's legislate it, let's write it into the laws, and you have to go. So I asked the question, well, what if they don't? What are you going to do? He said, like one of our deacons just said, off with their heads. It's good to know, follower of Jesus here. And he said, I don't know, throw them in jail. So you want to throw them in jail if they don't go to church on Sunday. Are they ever allowed to miss? Well, sure, they can miss occasionally. Okay, so occasionally, how often? Once a month. So otherwise you go to jail. Okay. Well, what if you made a law that they would go to jail if they don't go to church, but what if they didn't believe? Like, you have to go to church, it's the law, but what if they just went, but inside they didn't believe? Well, I'd make them believe. Okay. Well, how are you going to make them believe? Well, I'll question them. Okay, so we'll have an inquisition of questions to make sure they believe exactly what we say they have to believe, or they'll go to jail. Go to jail or go to hell. That's the rule, right? So is the simplistic religious mindset that states, you must follow my religion under penalty of law. And if you don't, we're going to have problems. There is a word for it in one of the religions we'll study tonight, and it's the word jihad. Now, jihad is a scary word for Americans who live post 9/11. Jihad, we don't like the idea. Holy war. We don't like the idea of holy war unless it's, it's with a cross rather than a Muslim symbol. Holy wars from 800 years ago, Crusades, they sound romantic and awesome. And standing for Jesus and taking the Holy Land. When you realize the Holy Wars or the Crusades were simply Christian perspectives of jihad. The demanding that people will believe the way I believe under penalty of the law. And so there have been certain Christians throughout history who have pushed back on the idea of governmental involvement in the church and church involvement in the government. Both. A separation of church and state. Now, before we misunderstand what I mean by that, those who believe, as I do, in a very clear delineation between church and state does not mean that somebody who believes like I do, that Christians should not be involved in government and being good citizens. It means that the government should stay out of the business of the church, and the church should not demand that the government enforce certain laws that are religious in nature. There is no state-run church. Christians throughout history, unfortunately, have embraced state-run churches, or what we would call nationalistic churches. And always, always, always to our detriment. Why? Because you can't command by legal statute that somebody believes in their heart anything. True Christianity is a decision of the mind, the emotion, the will, the desire from the inside to follow Christ. And you cannot legislate that. Today's session, session number 5, or part 5 of our series, Church History, is going to talk about both a new religion that was established 600 years after Christ called Islam, and the resulting Christian Crusades, or what we would call politicized Christianity or even militarized Christianity. And the back and forth that took place for hundreds of years and has roots even to this day. Or roots, I should say, has effects even to this day that many of you lived through at 9/11 and some still accidentally trip into when they say things like, we should not allow them to build a mosque there. It sounds like a good thing until we realize that's government interference in religious matters. Strict adherence to the concept of freedom of religion is a basic core tenet of biblical Christianity and what many of you would come to understand as historically important. So let's go ahead and talk about part 5, Islam and the Christian Crusades, as we all agree together that legislating religion is a bad idea. If you're not sure, by the end of tonight and next week's session, you'll know for certain. By the way, part 4 was the rise and fall of the Roman Church. That's part 4. Part 5 is going to take place in the same time period, the rise of Islam and the rise of the Christian Crusades. And then next week, we're going to study the same time period once again. And as we enter into the need for Reformation and the rise of the Reformation period, you'll find all of these fascinating. I'm in the midst of studying part 6 right now, and I really am excited. It's one of my favorite parts. So Islam and the rise of the Christian Crusades. So to begin with, you have to understand the Byzantine Empire. Now, what is the Byzantine Empire? If you're following along in your notes, if you're watching by way of YouTube later on, in class we have notes. If you email me and say, can I have the notes? I'll say, no, you did not show up live in person. So this is your benefit. But I will walk through most of the notes if you're watching by way of YouTube, weeks or months or years later. The rise of Islam and the Christian Crusades. First of all, the Byzantine Empire. This is the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, why do we make a distinction here? But because remember what we've talked about months ago or weeks ago in some of our sessions. Let's see, do I have that slide? I do not. We have a split of the Roman Empire. If you remember, the Roman Empire has grown so massive, so large, and the Roman government has become so disorganized and in shambles and fighting each other for years after the Republic became an empire that eventually it just became too top-heavy and it began to collapse, and it split into two empires, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire eventually becomes the Holy Roman Empire. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But the Eastern Roman Empire, that which was in the east, of course, becomes what we call the Byzantine Empire, or as some have referred to it as the, there we go, there's a map. The orange, the Byzantine Empire, okay? This entire area, this entire region of Greece, Cappadocia, Galatia, Bithynia, the regions of Turkey, all the way through the Holy Land, down into Egypt, Alexandria, North Africa. This region here, the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire was a continuation of the Roman Empire from 410 to 1453. So as we see the shift of the capital from Rome to Constantinople, we see that the Roman Empire moves east and it establishes a 1,000-year reign. It's a very powerful empire for a very, very long time, shockingly successful for many, many years. It survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire and continued to exist to the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, which is amazing. The fact that it lasted that long. And by the way, the Ottoman Empire would go on and would not even fall until when? The 20th century. So it's a fascinating study when you study a little bit more of this. Now, let's dig deeper. Constantine moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople in 330 AD. Constantinople is right here. It was formerly referred to as Byzantium or Byzantium, depending on how you pronounce it. And eventually this city would become the modern city of what? Istanbul. And so this is a very historically very important city, one of the most important cities in all of human history. And man, I'm looking forward to visiting it myself someday. And so this becomes the capital. This is where the emperor will rule for the next 1,000 years. And what happened to the Western Roman Empire? Well, the barbarians sacked Rome in 410 AD, and Constantinople further established the seat as the Roman emperors, and as I said, would last for 1,000 years. This is where we see one of the greatest archaeological success stories in human history, the Hagia Sophia, which was established as a church, built as a church by Justinian I in 537. Originally on this site the church was built by Constantine himself, just 30 years after his conversion. So the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, remember, sends his mom to the Holy Land, and moves the empire capital to this city, builds a church there. When he builds the church, eventually that church gets destroyed hundreds of years later, and the Hagia Sophia is built. I bring this out because those who study buildings and like to travel will notice this building well. By the way, it stayed and served as a church until 1453. So you end up seeing this church go for 900 years in this building for 900 years, when finally the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople and turned this building from a church into a, what do you think? A mosque, which again, from a Christian perspective, can be extremely insulting until you remember throughout Christian history, this is exactly what we did with other religious buildings. Christians would go in, take those religious buildings and turn them into church. So this church was turned into a mosque from 1453 until 1935. And in 1935, after World War I, before World War II, it was turned by the Turkey government into a what? A museum. And it stayed as a museum from 1935 all the way to the year 2020. And just 3 years ago, it was turned back into a mosque. So how many of you ever, while it was a museum, had an opportunity of actually visiting the Hagia? Okay, did you? Hagia Sophia, you've seen it? And before 2020, I suppose, of course. And so there to this day, one of the most beautiful buildings. But again, this building, the reason I bring up the Hagia Sophia is because it symbolizes what we're about to study, the back and forth of Christian and Muslim territory. And that's what we're going to see throughout the rest of tonight's session. There are entire cities, entire countries, entire regions that are fought for back and forth. Muslim control, Christian control, Muslim control, Christian control. And this all represents and symbolizes this one main truth, that Christianity had gone from a faith-based way of life to a political wrecking force that was on par with any political wrecking force. And it joined the pantheon of religions throughout history that have militarized their quote-unquote religion for the sake of political pursuit. And in so many words, bastardized the Christian faith into a political movement, unfortunately. Nonetheless, it gave us this beautiful building inside the Hagia Sophia, one of the most grand, outside of St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most grand interiors of any building in the entire world. fascinatingly enough. The Byzantine Empire, I want you to see the extent of it by looking at this map. The Byzantine Empire at its max and height was just massive. Just massive. So yes, the Roman Empire split between the East and the West, but when Justinian, which we don't have a lot of time to talk about, comes around in the 6th century, he's able to unify much of what was formerly the Roman Empire, not all, but much, and make it entire. You can see it by this red line around the entire Mediterranean. Massive growth. But you'll notice with this map, by the time you get 500 years later, the empire is just in the pink area. Basically Greece, southern Italy, Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey. And then by the time you get to the 1360s, you're just here in Macedonia, the dark red, and a little bit down in southern Greece. So the empire dramatically decreased. Now notice what's going on. The quote-unquote Christian, when I say empire is Christian, understand, empires can't be Christian. People can be Christian. Just like businesses can't be Christian. You know, one of the things I admire about Chick-fil-A, though Chick-fil-A is filled with Christians who lead it, they make it very clear. Chick-fil-A is not a Christian company because companies can't be Christian. Does that make sense? Countries can't be Christian. Businesses can't be, people are Christian. Now, if you fill that company or fill that business or fill that building with Christians, then it's a building or business or country filled with Christians. But they are not a Christian company or a Christian building or a Christian nation. You say that's semantics. It's really not. It has very much to do with everything we're talking about tonight and everything we're going to be talking about next week. But nonetheless, the quote-unquote Christian empire of Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire, began to shrink while another empire was growing. What empire? Let's talk about Islam. So the coming conflict was pretty obvious, was it not? While the Byzantine Empire was expanding, the new religious movement in Saudi Arabia was just being birthed. Islam and Christianity were destined to clash. As we see the shrinking of the Eastern Roman Empire, you see the expanding of the Islamic Empire, and you'll see that taking place now. Let's go ahead and talk about the Islamic Empire. How exactly did it begin? Well, it begins down in this peninsula, Saudi Arabia, in a city called Mecca. And in Mecca, there is a man who has an angel appear to him. The archangel Gabriel, according to his testimony, appears to Muhammad. And Muhammad is an average caravan trader. Obviously, he is a man who eventually is found to be a man of great intellect, of great leadership ability, a man who can gather a crowd and gather followers for certain. This happens in the 7th century, AD 610, according to the Roman time schedule of years, AD 610. He's in a cave near Mecca, and this message that he is given from this archangel eventually becomes the Quran. Islam is a strict monotheistic religion, which makes it unique among the religions of the world. There are 3 primary religions that are monotheistic. Islam, believing Allah is one God and Muhammad is his prophet. Judaism, the God of the Old Testament, Jehovah, Elohim by another name. And Christianity, who believes in one God who expresses himself in 3 persons, the Trinity, as we discussed 2 weeks ago. 3 monotheistic religions. We really are only covering those 3 religions in our study today. There are many religions throughout the world that have a plethora of gods, many gods, such as the Romans and the Greeks and the Swedes and the Far Eastern religions, Hinduism, and on and on. So this strict monotheistic religion establishes 5 pillars. And they have a list of 5 things, just like the very similar, that Judaism has the Ten Commandments, and Christianity has the seven sacraments, or I should say Roman Christianity has the seven sacraments, and Buddhism has the eightfold path of enlightenment. Islam has 5 pillars, and these are the duties of Islam, the religion of the Muslims, and they are confession of faith. And the way you confess the faith in the religion of Islam is to state that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. It is not enough of a confession of faith to say Allah is the one true God. It is enough to say there is only one God but Allah, and there is faith in his prophet Muhammad. If this confession of faith is not stated, you are not Muslim, and therefore not a part of their faith. Number 2, ritual of prayer, 5 times per day, wherever you're at, to pray in a moment of peace before sunrise, early afternoon, late afternoon, after sunset, and at night. Pillar number 3, this is fasting, to give up food and drink during the daylight hours of the month of Ramadan. Then number 4 is almsgiving, to give and share personal wealth to help people in need and support the Muslim community. And then lastly, pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is to perform a pilgrimage to Mecca at least one time in your lifetime. And if you perform all 5 of these pillars of Islam, this is the basis of the Islamic faith. Now, that is a simplification. That would be like saying to follow Judaism, just obey the 10 Commandments. That's a simplification of Judaism. This is a simplification of Islam. But nonetheless, it is a practical beginning point for sure. Now, that leads us to what we referred to earlier as what I talked to you about earlier as the clash between the Eastern Roman Empire, or what did I call the Eastern Roman Empire? What was the other name for the Byzantine Empire? The clash between the Byzantine Empire and the Arab Empire. The Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, the Islamic Empire versus the Christian, or what we would call the Eastern Roman Empire. And you can begin to see it grow quickly. Now, we see it expand, rapidly over 400 years, but especially in the early days, the Muslim caliphates expanded their territories, pushing the Byzantine Empire back quickly. Here in the dark brown, from your screen, it looks a little bit reddish, doesn't it? Does this look about red to you? So this is the expansion under the Prophet Muhammad. In 10 years, they had taken much of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, Yemen and Oman, what we would call in the modern tongue. And it expanded rapidly. It expanded rapidly because they were open to opportunity, and they expanded rapidly because of jihad, and that is the forced conversion of people by the sword. Now, do not get the idea that there were vast amounts of people converting to Islam simply because there was a sword to their neck. Not true. The reason why there was a vast amount of people willingly turning their back on Christianity and receiving a new, fresh religion is also because of the corruption of the Roman Church at the time. And we discussed the corruption of the Roman Church last week in our study. That's session number 4 on YouTube if you haven't gone back and watched it. In fact, one of the greatest, I believe, as an outside studier, a student of this time period, and granted, as a Christian of the 21st century, I see one of Muhammad's great catapults into the discovery of this religion is the fact that he looked at the Roman Catholic Church, or what he would see as the church, and saw its corruption and wanted something better, something more like God. And that makes sense when you see what was going on even during his era, and the desire for something pure, something better, something right. And so we see the rise of Islam. Now you see here during the patriarchal caliphate that took place over the next 30 years, you see it expand through Egypt into up and through the Promised Land, Iraq, Iran, up through the what would eventually be the Ottoman Empire, and farther east. And then eventually during the Umayyad Caliphate, it goes as far as Spain and Portugal, Morocco. Even if you go to Morocco today, all Muslim, and you'll see it spread even farther east to the borders of Pakistan all the way to India. And this is where we see much of the issues even today between Hinduism and Islam taking place in the Pakistani and Afghanistan region throughout this area. Fascinatingly enough. So all began here. Now, when it comes to Islam, understand that there are two main sects of Islam, and that's Sunni and Shia. Sunni would categorize it 85% of Muslims. Shia, 15% of Muslims. Osama bin Laden, which you're familiar with, ISIS, were both Sunni, so this is the largest group. And there are a lot of differences between the two. By the way, there are more than just two. That's like saying there are Protestants and Catholics. There are lots of different branches of Christianity, and we're going to study those branches since we're studying church history, not Islamic history. But to generalize, there are two branches of the Islamic faith, and you can study those online if you're interested. We have to move on. Under Sharia law, Christians and Jews could safely live. Now, that hasn't always been the case in all Muslim territory. In fact, even to this day, depending on which Muslim country you find yourself in, there are harsher responses depending on whatever the regime might be. But nonetheless, you could safely live as a Jew or a Christian inside of a caliphate, but you had to pay a special tax. The jizya was a tax that was a heavy tax, but if you were a Christian or a Jew, you just paid this specific amount of tax for not worshiping Allah, and you could have a community that you had. Now, again, for those of you who are Christian, which I assume most of you and I, if you ever wonder why it is that a secularist may get very nervous about nationalistic Christians, it's because they are afraid of something like this taking place. I'm not saying it's right, and I'm not saying we would. I'm saying from their point of view, there's no difference from Islam demanding a tax or follow all of our rules, right? Sharia law versus you live in a Christian community and you can't buy alcohol on Sundays and you're not allowed to, do this or that or whatever, follow our Christian laws. And if you don't follow our Christian laws, you go to jail. So I'm not saying that we would. I would say throughout historic history of Christianity, there have been times that people have used the cross and the Christian name to demand people live in a certain way that would not necessarily be by their conscience. But from a secularist viewpoint, there is a true terror inside of them that they are going to find themselves in a Christian regime that demands they live by Christian principles, or they'll have to pay tithes or taxes to a religion that they don't believe in. And Islam did this. And by the way, Christians throughout history, we're going to see next week, during the rise of the Reformation, why the Reformation took place is because there were many Christian countries and Christian communities that demanded you had to practice a certain way or you would be killed, burned at the stake. Christians burning other Christians at the stake because they didn't follow Christ the way they did. Again, I don't want to be so negative here, but I want to be nuanced in our study of Christianity, yeah? Right? I don't want to be like, Christians, the greatest heroes of all time, everybody else, terrible people. Not true. Just categorically not true. And you say, well, those people weren't true Christians. Those people who did those things, like we're going to talk about the Crusades, they weren't real Christians. 100%. I totally agree. Not true Christians. But that's like somebody who follows the Islamic faith saying those weren't real Muslims. From the outside, you could say that if that makes you feel better. It doesn't change the fact that under the banner of Christianity, a lot of bad things have happened. Yeah? Does this make sense? Okay. So everything shifts tremendously at the Battle of Manzikert, as you can see here. The empire and dominance of the Muslim Caliphate. Battle of Manzikert, in AD 170 is the decisive defeat that led to the steady decline of the Byzantine Empire and the dominance of the Muslim Caliphate. The Turks invaded and took Armenia and doing so along with the southern branch of the upper Euphrates River, and the Muslim invasion led to the First Crusade. So what happens basically is the Muslim forces come this way, the Christian forces come this way. This is 1,000 years after Christ. This is 1,000 years ago now. So halfway between Jesus and us. This battle is incredibly important that takes place right here. And when it does take place, you see the beginnings of the crusade. The Muslims have expanded so much that eventually the European Christian rulers say, we've got to do something about this Muslim problem. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, what's going on out west? We've talked about the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire is also called the what? The Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire is also called what? The Byzantine Empire. Out west, the Western Roman Empire is called what? We're going to call it the Holy Roman Empire, yeah. And so again, here's the split. You have the Eastern Roman Empire here in purple, and in red on the left, the Western Roman Empire. And we call this the Holy Roman Empire. Now, interestingly enough, the Holy Roman Empire officially is said to have lasted from 800 or AD 800 to 1806. The Holy Roman Empire, as one history professor of mine once said, was neither holy nor Roman, and eventually it wasn't much of an empire. So it's kind of a misnomer as you look at it. It all begins when Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Empire. Now notice this. This is a practice that would now continue for 1,000 years, where a religious leader crowns the political leader. There are all sorts of lines, if you're just a historical biblicist, that we're crossing that are not, this was not exactly what was intended by Jesus. Where there is a religious leader. Now, why did these religious leaders do this? For political gain, right? We know that we are stating by this holy religious leader putting a crown on the king, what we're saying is you are only in place because we allow you to be in place. Now, does that protect Christians? Yes, in a world where Christians at some points were not protected. Now they have overcompensated, and they've made it very clear that you won't be in power without us, right? And this takes place, this continues, by the way, for the next 1,000 years. Does anybody remember the interesting historical figure who would not allow himself to be crowned by any pope? Henry VIII. Yeah, we're going to talk about him 2 weeks from now, for sure. But later on, there was a Frenchman, who would not allow any pope to crown him. In fact, he took the crown from the pope, placed it on himself. Who was that? Napoleon. And that was a bold statement of Napoleon. Very interesting. But nonetheless, Charlemagne is a fascinating study if you ever want to study him. We don't have a lot of time. But Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne emperor, and this of this primarily Germanic empire. And that really is what it is. If you really want to understand what happened to the Western Roman Empire, you can basically say it becomes Germany. That's really what the Holy Roman Empire was. The unification of Germany would not happen until the 19th century. Like, it doesn't happen until the 1800s. They were all a bunch of little kingdoms. And that's why if you ever go to Germany and you go up and down the Rhine, which I have not done yet, but you'll see little castle here, little castle here, little castle here. Why do you see that? It's because there were a bunch of little castles and little despots and little kingdoms all over. And they were just a bunch of really wealthy, powerful people. And then the unification of Germany brought it all together. Before that, it was called the Holy Roman Empire. It was a conglomeration of a bunch of quote unquote Christian kings in their villages. So remembered by the German people, by the way, the Holy Roman Empire is remembered by the German people as the First Reich. And it took place between 800 and 1806. Then there was the Second Reich that took place from 1871 all the way to 1918. Yeah? The arrival of the First World War or the story of the First World War, right? And then the Second Reich ended, and then that gave rise to eventually the what? The Third Reich, right? And this is exactly what Adolf Hitler was proposing as he rose to power in the 1930s and said, hey, we can bring back the glory of what? The Holy Roman Empire. And that's why Adolf Hitler used Christian terminology and used Christian statements and used Christian symbolism as much as he did, because he was trying to connect himself to the First Reich, the Second Reich, and they being the Third Reich. Wicked man who used Christian symbols to kill God's people. Amazing. But nonetheless, this is the Holy Roman Empire. Again, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but this is what was going on. And this, by the way, this continued all the way up until the Napoleonic Wars. The Holy Roman Empire is finally abolished by Napoleon and the rise of Napoleon. And because Napoleon was not simply a Frank, he was not simply a leader of France. He was a European, and he wanted to unite all of Europe under his power. And we remember him much more fondly than some of the other dictators from Europe in centuries later or centuries before. But Napoleon was no less of a gruesome man than a lot of these other dictators and self-appointed men. This allows us to arrive at what we see as what we'll call the Great Schism of 1054. Now, it might seem like we're jumping from topic to topic. We are. But I'm trying to cover some broad, I should say very important moments throughout what we would call the Middle Ages. And another important moment throughout the Middle Ages for Christian history is what we call the Great Schism of 1054. What is the Great Schism of 1054? This is where the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire divide. You see the Holy Roman Empire in the West, and you see the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Church, split on the right. The Roman Catholic Church was in the West, the Eastern Orthodox or Byzantine Church was on the East, and this is what gives rise to the Orthodox churches. So when you talk about the Greek Orthodox Church or the Roman Orthodox Church or the Polish Orthodox Church or the Ethiopian Orthodox Church would come down here, and it doesn't show this on this map, but the Ethiopian Orthodox Church finds its history in the Eastern Orthodox branch. What was the schism over? Well, it was over statues, among other things. It was really political, but the thing that was most interesting to talk about historically was statues. And let's just say some of them one side liked statues and the other one didn't like statues. So it became a big thing. And it split the church. All right, that brings us to the Crusades. Now, when we arrive at the Crusades, there is a romanticized idea of the Crusades. You think of Knights of the Round Table. You think of big swords and dragons, and it's just a flesh wound. All these kind of things come to mind, thank you, of knights, right? And really what was going on here was the utilization of Christian icons and symbols for the sake of unifying. Now, Christian, you've got to understand, Christians are supposed to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves, but sometimes we fall for the same things over and over and over. And that is using Christian symbolism, using Christian props, using Christian language, and even using stories of conversion to rally a political movement for political power purposes. And this has happened forever. Now, there have always been people who are awake and alive, alert to it, and be like, I don't think that's what Christians are going on. The problem is not with Christians who recognize or don't recognize, it's with the unbelievers who do recognize, is what you're doing really Christian? And that can have major implications for centuries, as does we'll see with the Crusades. But nonetheless, there is a major split, as you can see, And while the Eastern Orthodox Church is very strong, what's coming against it? Islam. And Islam is rapidly growing much faster than the church. And so what does the Holy Roman Empire do? Well, they combine with the Eastern Orthodox Church in many ways, and they combine together and they march on the Holy Land to take back the Holy Land. I mean, doesn't it bother you? Here we are living in Germany. We have a nice village on the Rhine. We worship Jesus. I think we know about him. Like, that's what the priest tells us. Now, I've never read the Bible, and you've never read the Bible, and I'm pretty sure our priest doesn't read Latin. But we all worship this God named Jesus, and he's from this city called Jerusalem, and there's a bunch of wicked people who worship a demon who live in the city down there. And we need to go take back the city of Jesus. And all we need to do is, if we just go down there in the power of God, like, we can go take back the city that belongs to Jesus. And if we do, maybe God will like us and our crops will grow better. And so let's go down and take it back. And that's exactly what takes place. And so we see the rise of the First Crusade. Here's the map of the First Crusades. It begins in the land of France and Germany. In AD 1095, Pope Urban II wanted to unite Europe, so he rallied the lords and the kings of Europe to assist the Byzantines to liberate Jerusalem. It's believed that the popes, now why the Pope? Because again, the Pope was the most important political force of the day. Though there were kings, all of the kings followed one person, the Pope. So he's the most important political person of the day. And his goal was to unite all of Europe. Maybe a praiseworthy idea, right? But the way he was going to do it is the way a lot of political leaders lead, and that is to create an enemy. There's an enemy out there, and what we need to do is we need to all get upset at that enemy, go after that enemy. They're going to destroy our way of life, and we got to destroy their way of life before they destroy our way of life. And so they all gathered together, and for the purpose of uniting Europe, he rallied the lords and the kings of Europe to assist the Byzantines to liberate Jerusalem. We want to free Jerusalem, and so that's what they do. They go down and free Jerusalem. This will be a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Peasants were led by their feudal lords to the holy city. Now think about it. These peasants, they could neither read nor write. The feudal system, which we don't have time to study, you can study on your own. The feudal system basically worked like, you didn't own the land, but the king owned the land, and you got to work the land, and he gave you a little bit of the food that you earned, right? And so you could neither read, you could neither write, you had no education, you had no opportunity. The guy you worked for was the big shot, and the big shot came to you one day and said, he didn't come to you, he came and said, we're all going on this adventure because God told us to, and if you do, we'll have better crops, which basically means I get to be rich and you still stay doing what you do. Hopefully you don't die on the pilgrimage. But God might like you, and maybe you'll go to heaven, who knows, maybe. And so he gets all of his people, and they start heading down to fight and reclaim Jerusalem for Jesus. And so many people died. It wasn't just political leaders, unfortunately. It was people like me, preachers like Peter the Hermit, convinced thousands to follow him to the Holy Land. He went around village to village and preached to people. And Peter the Hermit, little do people know, he was actually a frog. They called him Herbert the Frog. It's Kermit the Frog. Is it too soon? 1,000 years ago? Okay, all right, let's move on. By 1100, Catholics held both Antioch in Syria and Jerusalem in Israel as Roman Christian kingdoms. So the First Crusade, successful political maneuver? Yes. From a political maneuvering perspective, they actually were able to do it. They took over Edessa, they took over Antioch, they took over Jerusalem. They held them as Christian kingdoms. Now, granted, the Muslims took it back just a few decades later, like 20 years later. We lost everything. And all those people who died, well, they died. But they got glory in heaven, right? Right? Because that's what the Bible says. All you have to do is politically take over another city, and God will honor you in the kingdom. I think it's in there somewhere. In the Latin, maybe. I don't know. It's not true. I'm joking online. Okay, all right. And so here we see an artist's rendering from the Renaissance period of what he thinks it looked like 500 years before when Jerusalem was taken in the name of Jesus. The Second Crusade. By the way, it was a political and military success story. By 1100, as I said, Catholics held Antioch, Catholics held Jerusalem, and both were now considered Roman Christian kingdoms. The Second Crusade. It takes place just 50 years after the First Crusade. And 50 years later, they're ready to go at it again. And this one, the Second Crusade, well, it was a total disaster for the Crusaders. They lost in Anatolia and in Damascus. Their one success was to capture Lisbon. They actually went all the way east as well as west. Maybe that wasn't a good idea. But nonetheless, it really did not work out well. However, they didn't make progress in the Holy Land at all. So, the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade takes place just 35 to 40 years after the Second Crusade. Again, this is all in the 11th and 12th century. And there was a Muslim leader named Saladin of Egypt who took Jerusalem back in 1187. And the Pope challenged the monarchs of Europe, and the three kings took up the challenge. So now you have political, I should say religious, spiritual, abusive power who's pushing the kings of Europe to really back this Third Crusade so they could take everything that they actually want to take. And they make Saladin as this great warrior that they have to fight. And so three of them take up the charge. Who are those three that take up the charge? They come from France region, down through the Mediterranean, down through Sicily, and across to the Holy Land. Who were these three? Oops, excuse me. Did I go back too fast? Okay, who were these three? They were Frederick Barbarossa, Richard I, and Philip II. So Philip II was of France. Frederick Barbarossa was the king of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor. And by the way, he actually ended up drowning in a river while bathing during the crusade, so that didn't go well for him. Legend says that they actually pickled him inside of a barrel in vinegars so they could ship him back so that he could be buried. So that is a fun fact. And then the third one is Richard I, who we have in the middle picture there, Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. Now, he's well known in your literature, my literature. Where do we find Richard I found in our literature? In Robin Hood, that's right. Yeah, this would be Richard the Lionheart, right? And how many of you remember Prince of Thieves remember Prince of Thieves when we were kids, right? Yeah, that was a good movie. I'll die for you, I'll cry for you, walk the world for you, I'll die for you. You know it's true, everything I do, I do it for you. All right. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Anyway, Kevin Costner classic. What does, you're like, I do remember that movie, but you just ruined it for me. Richard I of Lionheart of England, he goes away, and that's when the Robin Hood legend takes place. And in the stories of Robin Hood, Richard I comes back. Why? Because King John is ruining everything. We need Richard I. Where was he away? Where was he during the stories of Robin Hood? Where was he? He was on the Third Crusade. Now, there was no Robin Hood, right? I mean, maybe whatever, the legend of Robin Hood. But where was he while he was away and Prince John was, pilfering the treasury with that little snake of his, right? From the Disney cartoon. Okay, this is my extent of history. Anyway, they actually ended up failing to take Jerusalem. However, now Egypt had become a target for the Crusaders. Take Egypt and you'll be able to take Jerusalem. That had become the rally charge by the time of the Fourth Crusade. The whole concept now was because Egypt had become more powerful once again, they believed that if they had to go in and take Egypt first, then they could take Egypt, then they could come from Egypt and follow the same pathway of Moses from Egypt up Jerusalem and then take it. So the Fourth Crusade was just that. It was their plan to leave from Venice, go down to Egypt, go and destroy Egypt, and then come up and take the Holy Land back. And oh my goodness, it did not work out well. The Fourth Crusade is the greatest tragedy of all the Crusades, and it's kind of a joke, really. Pope Innocent III is the one who established this. The whole idea was conquer Egypt first, then Jerusalem. They built the largest naval fleet since the Roman Empire. So you understand, this is 1,000 years after the Roman Empire, the height of the Roman Empire. They built the largest naval fleet for 1,000 years for one reason, and that is to go take Egypt and then the Roman Empire. But as you can see, according to the map, do they ever make it to Egypt? No, the map is too small, Pastor. We have no idea. No, the answer is no. They don't go down to Egypt. Do they ever make it to Jerusalem? No, they don't. On their way to Jerusalem and Egypt, the Crusaders were offered another opportunity by a Byzantine prince. And this was the offer. Now, if this doesn't show you this was just all about politics, nothing ever will. The offer from the Byzantine prince was, restore my father to the throne of Constantinople, and we will pay you handsomely and join your crusade. But immediately after the success of putting his guy's father back in power, the newly minted emperor of Constantinople was dethroned by a people's uprising. This meant that no money would be paid to the Crusaders. So, do you see what happened? The Crusaders were on the way. These people are like, hey, why don't you help us on the way? And they're like, sure, we'll help you. Will you give us money? Yeah, we'll give you money and we'll fight with you. So they win, and everybody's like, yay, we won. And then all of a sudden, the people rose up against them, said, we don't want them. They killed the emperor, and what they did, or the leader, and as they killed the king, guess what? Nobody was going to get paid. Now you've got all these Christian Crusaders who aren't going to get paid. What do you think they're going to do? They ransack Constantinople and they plunder the city, they slaughter thousands, and they steal everything they could. And these Crusaders become incredibly wealthy in doing so. You say, do they get away with it? I mean, they're going to stand before God. They stood before God. But in this world, yeah, they got away with it. They took all their vast amounts of wealth like pirates, like they're like Jack Sparrow over here. They take all of their amounts of wealth and they go and establish little mini kingdoms all throughout Greece and throughout this region of Turkey. And this is where the last Crusaders ended up living the rest of their life. This essentially was a death blow to the once great Byzantine Empire. There's another artist rendering. So this was a death blow to the once great Byzantine Empire. The Crusaders, who had now been excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, took their new wealth and established themselves as lords over minor kingdoms. And, of course, they took no Holy Land. So what happened then? Well, there was a power vacuum, and power hates a vacuum. So this power vacuum led to the region would be filled by the growing Ottoman Empire, or the new Muslim Empire. And the new Muslim Empire, the Ottoman Empire, would then reign supreme all the way to the 20th century, the same century many of you were born. So that is the rise of Islam and the quote-unquote Christian Crusades. Next week, the need for reformation. So, what do we do? Well, the name of Christ has been dragged through the mud. Christianity has been completely, seemingly lost on the large world scale, though there are minor pockets of Christians that have continued to follow Christ in purity and in truth all over the world in small churches. So what needs to happen? Reformation. People are going to stand up and protest against the main political institution called the church, and they're going to try to reform it. That leads to the Protestant Reformation.